I'm Felicity Thomas. I am the Associate Director of Editorial and Content for the Pharma Navigator. Today, I've got a panel of esteemed experts with me, who I will introduce in a moment, but we're going to be doing, this is a virtual recording of our CPHI Frankfurt 2025 panel discussion, which was on sustained availability of excipients and patient impact. Thanks very much for joining me today. So today I've got Ian Moore, who concluded his 36-year career with Croda, a supplier of excipients, in 2023 as Head of Global Quality Assurance, responsible for 60 sites in the group. Since then, Ian's worked as Senior Advisor Operations for Exipact, the global GMP and GDP certification scheme for excipients. Thanks for joining me, Ian.
You're welcome.
I also have Nigel Langley, Global Technical Director, GChem, who has over 100 scientific publications and has co-edited 3 books. Nigel's been IPEC America's Chair, 2022 to 2023, and is currently the immediate past chair. Nigel's also on the Medicine Makers Power List for 2020, 2021 and 2022 and is a member of the USP Excipients Monograph 2 Expert Committee 25 to 2030. Thanks for joining me, Nigel.
Thank you, Felicity. It's good to be here.
We've also got Rob Williams, who is the Senior Director of Sustainable Procurement in AstraZeneca's Global Procurement Team and Chair of PSCI, Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Initiative. Rob works with AstraZeneca's global supplier base, developing high-performance supply chains to deliver truly sustainable business growth. Rob leads on reducing AstraZeneca's Scope 3 emissions towards net zero, driving responsible supply chains and sustainable sourcing. Thanks for joining us, Rob. We also have Bram Bert, who holds a PhD in pharmaceutical sciences and began his professional career at Pfizer Manufacturing Belgium, where he acquired substantial expertise in product quality and regulatory compliance. For nearly a decade, Bram has been with Lonza Capsules and Health Ingredients Division, where he currently serves as Head of Global Regulatory Affairs. Bram is also an active contributor to IPEC Europe and the IQ-IPEC Collaboration Group, where he engages in industry-wide initiatives focused on quality and regulatory advancement. Thanks for joining us, Bram.
My pleasure to be here.
So, obviously, we've already laid out what we're going to be talking about. And I think, first of all, we need to give the definition of excipients and also a perspective on the current shape of the global market. So, Ian, would you like to start us off, please?
Yes, thank you very much, Felicity. Well, in Europe, excipients are legally defined as everything else in the drug product that's not the active ingredient. But actually, I prefer the IPEC definition, which is along the same lines, but includes the requirement that they're intentionally added as well. It's important to realise excipients are administered to the patient by intent, and so they must be manufactured in accordance with GMP principles. Then we need to recognise that they are included in the drug product because they have a role to play in the therapy and the delivery of the therapy. That role can range from very simple as a bulking agent in a tablet that delivers a 10 milligram dose to the patient, right through to the lipid nanoparticles that encapsulate the messenger RNA in vaccine and related therapies. It's really, really important, though, not to confuse the role of the delivery of the therapy with activity. Excipients are, by definition, inert when it comes to therapeutic effect. In terms of the global market, then geopolitical pressures, onshoring and so on, are putting strain on the approval of new excipient suppliers. The question everybody has, drug products regulators too in many countries, how do I identify a good, reliable, committed supplier of excipients? The first step in answering that question is to get evidence they've applied good manufacturing practices, GMP. The use of GMP global certification schemes like Excipact has greatly facilitated the approval of new excipient suppliers to the acceptance of industry and increasingly the regulators as well.
You mentioned there's mRNA and things like that. We've obviously seen, impacts on the excipient market. So I want to kind of delve into that a little bit more because novel therapies are becoming more and more prevalent. So Nigel, I'm going to flip over to you for a minute to talk about the impact, particularly of novel therapeutic modalities. You know, are we seeing that excipients are being left behind, do you think, in that field?
Yes, thank you for listening. It's a very interesting question, and I think it's very true. I think what I see, and I think the industry shares this same sentiment, is that formulators are still using products that can be 50, 60, 70 years old, insofar as that's when they were first introduced into pharmaceutical applications. Well, that's the excipient side. The modalities, as you mentioned, have really progressed rapidly, especially in the biologics area. And I personally feel that the excipient innovation has been quite stagnant, and there's reasons for it. And I tried to explain some of those reasons just in a minute. But for sure, I feel that the excipient side has been left behind a little bit. The reality is that probably over 90% of excipients, if not more, have not been designed for a purpose that they're being used in formulation. They're not fit for purpose as we describe them to be. And as a result of that, then they have to, in some cases, be stressed or micronized or in a different type of physical form in order to actually carry out the function that's desired in a particular formulation. Clearly, that's not desired. And I think we've come into a point where now that's kind of even more challenging, and the attrition in the pharmaceutical area will become more so, I believe, because some of these interesting drug candidates are just not formulatable with the excipients that are currently around. Now, how can we do something about that? We had some really positive news a few years ago when IPEC was very much involved in this story, as well as the IQ Consortium and the USP, to actually get to a point where the FDA recognized, or we felt they recognized, the need for novel excipient innovation, and also to have a mechanism whereby hopefully the regulatory hurdles or the barriers would be lowered a little bit in order for that to happen. As a result, the FDA introduced a pilot review program for novel excipient evaluation called PRIME, a 2-year program that actually ran for 3 years in the end. We're not sure, actually, and we haven't had a definitive response from the FDA, especially from IPEC Americas, whether this program will continue. There's no word, although we've asked that question several times of the FDA. So we're not sure whether the program will continue. We suspect it won't, which is a real pity. As you know, the FDA have had some challenges, I would say, this year. And maybe it's not the time to sort of push that this time. But we will try to revisit certainly next year and see whether we can reintroduce and have the dialogue with the FDA, because the situation still remains. I mean, you mentioned the messenger RNA vaccines. Well, they both contain novel excipients. There were 2 major ones, and they had a novel excipient in each of them. Well, they weren't just produced overnight. They were available. It would be a very sad case, in my opinion, that we would need to have another pandemic before a next novel excipient is actually adopted and used in a pharmaceutical drug product. We've gone back a little bit in time, I think. I sense that the innovation incentive now for excipient suppliers is basically reverted to what it was before the pandemic. And unless we work collaboratively in the industry, I think it's going to be very challenging to develop new novel excipients in the future and introduce them, because the investment and the return on investment for a supplier themselves is challenging itself to have that conversation internally in companies. You know, if it takes 10 to 20 years with uncertainty that you'll have return on the capital investment that you put into this, and it's not trivial. So in order to advance excipient innovation, I personally believe that pharma companies and excipient suppliers need to really talk to each other more closely and really identify where the market needs or the needs are, and and then work together in some way to actually develop and incentivize that process. So that's sadly that's the situation we find ourselves in.
Yeah, and we're obviously facing quite an interesting situation at the moment where there's potentially going to be certain ingredients being banned. You know, I mean, I know titanium dioxide, for example, in Europe, that's a different case, and the EMA have said, issued their findings on that, but we're not sure about America at the moment, so at the time of recording. So I want to talk about the legislation side of it. Are they too restrictive? And Bram, I'm going to come to you for this one. Do you think, you know, obviously I've spoken about the regional differences there. We've got titanium dioxide. What are these bans going to do, you know, for excipients? How are they going to impact manufacturers and things like that? Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, thank you, Felicity, for the interesting question. Whether or not regulations are too restrictive is subject to interpretation, but for sure regulations are posing restrictions, and this, in fact, in various ways. So Nigel already touched upon such restrictions in the context of novel excipients. In many regions, there is indeed a lack of regulations that allow for an independent excipient approval, which means that excipient manufacturers are in fact largely dependent on excipient users to advocate for new excipients to be used in their drug products. And the situation creates uncertainty for the drug product manufacturers on obtaining approval for their marketing authorizations. Drug product manufacturers are not always willing to take such risks, and so this really demonstrates how the current regulatory framework is restricting innovation in the excipient world. Another regulatory area where I see restrictions are diverging regional requirements for excipients, especially in terms of specifications. And such differences in specifications may make it impossible to find a grade that meets all of these specifications. As a result, companies have to create regional stock keeping units. That's add complexity to the supply chain, and sometimes it even restricts the availability of certain materials for certain markets. And then there's, of course, also these direct bans that you were already referring to. So this is typically about new or updated regulation that is prohibiting the use of certain excipients that have been used for a long time because of potential safety concerns. And of course, it is good that substances that have already been on the market for a long time are now being reassessed by competent authorities according to contemporary safety standards, but the regulatory decision-making process is sometimes confounded. And titanium dioxide is a nice example. It is being banned in the European Union for use as a food colorant because the European Commission was no longer able to confirm its safety based on current scientific data. However, many other authorities, including the US FDA, Health Canada, Australia, Brazil, Japan, and many others came to a different conclusion. Red-3 is another example. So the FDA banned the use of Red-3 as a colorant in both food and pharmaceutical applications, marketed in the US as from 2027 or 2028 respectively. But although the FDA confirmed in their reevaluation that they see no safety concerns with the use of Red-3 as a colorant, they in fact had to ban it because of an old clause in the US law that does not allow for a risk-based approach, and that may therefore pose unjustified restriction. Of course, it goes without saying that substances that truly pose a safety concern should be banned, but unilateral bans that are not supported by solid, sound scientific evidence, they pose unnecessary burden for the pharmaceutical industry. Products have to be reformulated, and this may ultimately even lead to patients not receiving their drug products.
Yeah, and that solid, sound scientific evidence, I think, is key there, and it brings me on to the issue of misinformation, which is something that we've seen happening more and more, particularly as more people use social media and they're broadening their audiences that way. So, and I'm going to stay with you, Bram, what can be done to help mitigate the issue of misinformation? What actions should stakeholders in the industry be taking, do you think?
Yeah, it's clear that the pharmaceutical industry cannot simply fight this misinformation by posting facts demonstrating opposite messaging. So it's all about transparent communication, providing an understandable version of the scientific facts, as well as providing the full context with not only focusing on positive elements, but also acknowledging risks and uncertainties. But this is only the base. In addition, the trust of the public should be gained by, for example, working together with healthcare practitioners or patient advocacy groups. Also, I think that the pharmaceutical industry should support educational initiatives, of course, on social media, but also beyond. And we should also live up to ethical standards and, for example, adopt strict internal policies against misleading advertising or selective data presentation. In short, the goal is not just to become a source of information, but to be a credible participant in the public dialogue about health.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about protective actions then. I think we need to also address falsification. We've seen severe consequences of falsifications, happening, even death to some patients around the world. India, for example, cough medicines, Rob, maybe you can step in here. What action should industry be taking to help mitigate the risks of falsification in the excipient supply chain?
Yeah, it's a great question and a growing challenge for all of us. Well, we've got information overload almost from the data that's now available online and indeed available to everyone, as Bram was just talking about, information available to the public. We've got to find that science-based information that means we can assure ourselves and our patients, our customers, of the quality and the efficacy of all of the component parts of the products we produce. So I think it really comes down to supply chain due diligence. The practice of supply chain due diligence, of course, is enhanced through data, through AI, through web scraping, through information that's now really widely available, but has got to be properly analysed, properly handled, and properly vetted as well. And that vetting, that assurance is critical. So the process of supply chain due diligence, of course, supported by robust and ethically viable certification is critical as well. So companies such as members of PSCI, the member companies of PSCI, will rely firstly perhaps on certification, on standards, and on those third-party verification certificates that we look for suppliers to provide. But that supply chain due diligence is critical. If you can't trace back from step to step, if you can't trace the certification and the origins of materials back step to step, then obviously questions are going to start to be raised. So I think the ability to undertake correct due diligence is there, but of course there are always bad actors, and what we need to do as an industry is really make sure that when there are challenges, that those are widely known, widely represented, to really make sure that things don't happen twice.
Yeah, so transparency is pretty key then,
Yes.
for the supply chain. Is there, could you give us a rundown of the key supply chain issues for excipients and highlight any lessons that have been learned? The pandemic obviously was a big, option to learn some lessons there. So could you maybe give us a rundown of those, of the key supply chain issues and the lessons that, have been learned or those that still need to be learned by industry?
Yeah, surely. And I think, again, it's the framework that we apply through the Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Initiative, I think, gives a good guidance there. And this doesn't apply just to excipients, but I think to all the pharmaceutical products, medtech as well. And it's really, respecting some of those foundational commitments, whether that's human rights, environmental sustainability, and responsible business, but companies setting out the standards they expect of their suppliers. So the PSCI principles are the starting point for those 85 member companies of PSCI. But they start at really governance and management systems. Those governance and management systems underpinned by another principle of ethics, good ethics, which are well represented and understood by all parties, both within the companies, but importantly throughout the supply chain. The ethics can present challenges, as we've just been talking about, with falsification. Human rights issues is an increasing challenge that actually the customers of the pharmaceutical sector are really interested in. Recent audit evidence and I think recent representation by customers to PSCI members suggests actually that's towards the top of the list of concerns. So assuring that there are no human rights risks in the supply chains are critical. And of course, a safe and healthy working environment, thinking of health and safety, or SHE or EHS as you may present it, is critical. We've recently seen significant number of fatalities associated with excipient manufacture in India, and so those health and safety risks, in that case an MCC production site, are really paramount. The environmental issues then around environmental discharges, that's regulated environmental discharges, I think are a final but really important principle that we know all supply chains must maintain. The reason I cover all of those topics is because failure of any one of those topics can disrupt supply of medicines to patients, whether that's a human rights issue, whether it's health and safety issue, whether it's an environmental discharge challenge. And so there's a broad range of topics which actually, as a pharma industry, we look to and ensure there's consistent standards on to support the application of those consistent standards up the supply chain to the excipient manufacturers, the raw material producers. But that supply chain transparency across all of those topics is vital to ensure that supply of medicines.
Yeah, and the environmental side. So obviously we're seeing for sustainability, for example, a massive kind of legislative sort of push for greater sustainability, particularly in Europe. So in light of that, what kind of impact might we expect on excipients as a result of greater sustainability requirements? And Bram, I'm going to pop it back over to you for this one to start.
Yeah, indeed, sustainability is very important and is only going to become more important. We will see certainly impact on packaging practices. So the European Packaging and Packaging Waste Regulation has already been published and is gradually being implemented as from next year. But we also expect a shift towards more sustainable sourcing practices, a higher transparency on the environmental impact of our products. And of course, this is about reduction of carbon emissions, but it's also on the impact on air, on water, on biodiversity. And so I think that companies need to make sure that they have the in-house capabilities and the expertise to consider environmental sustainability aspects of their products and operations, and also make sure that this is visible and available to their partners.
Sticking on the kind of environmental side of things, obviously we're seeing more adverse weather events happening across the world. The climate crisis is, an inherently, exponential problem that we need to deal with. How are such adverse weather events impacting, the global supply chain for excipients, and how might companies negotiate, those sorts of challenges that they're facing in terms of those supply chain hurdles? Do you think, Rob, can I pop it back over to you?
Sure. I mean, supply chain resilience, as we've just been talking about, as Bram's just talked about, is fundamental to making sure whether it's excipients or it's active ingredients can really continue supply. We've seen issues in the east coast of the US. We've seen high temperatures. That's with flooding. Issues with high temperatures in other parts of the world really can disrupt production of materials. Production sites, actually working in the fields can become a real risk in high temperature environments. And so everything from individual workers in a raw material production setting through to factory settings can be subject to disruption through high temperatures or indeed a lack of water availability as well. So those changes in climate need us to plan for resilience greater. And those dual source paths maybe need to be triple source. But again, the assurance all the way through there that seemingly two supply chain paths at tier 1 or tier 2 of the supply chain don't then combine at tier 3 is then a real challenge for us all to say. So going back to that traceability, that supply chain due diligence that assures that supply all the way through. But I think increasingly businesses are looking to plan for these things, understand the risk at supply chain sites of things which we weren't exposed to 20 years ago. And so new factors for us to consider, but ones that can be brought together with sound science and good quality insurance.
Yeah, another issue that's been raised, particularly with the current geopolitical turbulence that we've been experiencing, is, well, it's spoken about again, shall we say, with a bit more gusto, is onshoring or reshoring to improve the supply chains. Where are we up to in terms of onshoring or reshoring at the moment, and what sort of impact is that having on the patient? Rob, do you want to start us off? I'm sure other people might want to join in on this one.
Yeah, the onshoring or reshoring debate, and I'll start with the sustainability perspective, is a really interesting one. I think the disruptions in supply we've seen through the application of geopolitics, I think is just shining another light on, where should we be looking for sources of materials. Some, of course, are geographically limited in where they can be produced from, and so there's restrictions there. But increasingly looking to synthetic alternatives to natural raw materials provides for onshoring opportunities or just a greater geographical base to produce from. But that, I think, is underpinning then the continuing supply of medicines to patients. I think that onshoring for sustainability reasons for carbon, I think there's real data needed in that space.
Yeah.
What proportion of the overall carbon footprint of an excipient is formed by the transport of that material? I think the general evidence points it's a relatively small part. So I think there's other factors that need to be considered, probably more in the resilience of supply, the opportunity for synthetics, and certainly the reduction of impact on nature, which is largely becoming it's an associated issue along with climate now. And I think many companies are recognizing that to have healthy people, we have to have a healthy planet. And so nature and climate go together in that space.
Yeah, maybe I can add something as well to this picture. From the economic side to actually manufacture these types of products. I mean, I see the industry basically at two parts. So you have the innovator side, which is patent protected, of course, the drugs that are developed that way, and then you have the generic industry.
Yeah.
I think the two are very different with respect to onshoring and the economics behind the possibility and the probability of that happening. If I may, the innovators, you can see that the profit margins are still high because the investment's there and the patent life supports that until they go off patent to become generics themselves. On this flip side, the generic industry, the profit margins are very slim. And the infrastructure in some of the countries now for making those types of products has disappeared, basically. The large footprints to manufacture has been replaced over the years and moved to different parts of the world, such as India and China, for example. Not just the final drug product, but the drug substance as well, the active materials. A lot of them come from different countries and not actually made in everywhere. So you've got two things. You've got the drug product and in some cases the API that you need to manufacture and onshore that. And I think it's going to be a challenge. I think maybe we're slightly naive to think that companies will invest there because the economics don't work. So you may then have to have big government support to actually onshore all the pharmaceutical products, not just the innovator ones.
It's a very difficult question. I mean, obviously, if you want to onshore, then you've got to identify your supplier, as you were saying, Nigel, and then you're going to need to qualify them quickly. And I mean, that in itself is not a trivial matter. You have to be assured that they've got the right quality standard on the excipient, that they're a genuine actor in the supply chain. And of course, they demonstrate that they've implemented good manufacturing practice and a good distribution practice as well. All of that takes some time. It's great. We've got guides and help available from the International Pharmaceutical Excipients Council. IPEC have published a number of guides here, excipient information packages, quality agreement templates to accelerate this. And what we need then is to make sure that industry is using all of those tools to facilitate the quick approval or of new suppliers or reapproval of old ones that you've left behind maybe, but without any loss of quality in that process or any compromise to patient safety. The good news is that those kind of tools are available and we should be using them.
Yeah, and adding up onto this from a quality perspective, this may indeed be an advantage also from onshoring. It's important also to perform on-site visits to make sure that the supplier meets as mentioned by the GMP requirements, the standards that are needed to ensure safe products. And having, of course, a supplier that is nearby can facilitate indeed this type of quality activity. So from that perspective, it's a positive thing, and it may result in improved quality of medicines for patients.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I want to look to the future now. So if you can all get your crystal balls out, what might we expect in the near future? And let's bring it to the title of this panel discussion. What can help ensure the sustained availability of excipients, in your opinion? So who wants to kick us off on this one?
Yeah, I can certainly start that. There's been some exciting news, I think, this year, driven out of the sad news around the falsification of excipients and the infant deaths that have occurred yet again. But what we are now seeing is that regulators around the world are taking heed of that, and they're starting to act. They're starting to require that good manufacturing practices are applied to excipients globally, and that the duty then is of the drug product manufacturer to utilize excipients made according to GMP, and they have to gather the evidence that's been applied. What I see as great there is that the regulators are actually listening to organisations like IPEC and Excipient, because we have a lot of knowledge about what the excipient industry looks like and the standards it's been applying, and they have been listening. So what we're seeing, I think, is mirrors a little bit what happened during COVID and development of those vaccines. The regulators, the pharmaceutical companies, the suppliers are all working together and facilitating and promoting patient safety as a theme. And I think that's great development. I certainly want to see that accelerate in the future, and that collaboration to work, because then we can be, we're working together, and that means, we're stronger and patient safety is more assured.
So I think that's an interesting connector, if I were, for collaboration. I think it's not just in that part of the industry. I think it should be everywhere if we can.
Yeah.
I touched on this a little bit earlier on the innovation side, but I feel that if we're going to keep pace, certainly with how the modalities are developing on the excipient innovation side, we just need to do that more. Mm-hmm. And we need to find a mechanism that needs to be consistent and not just in pockets of collaboration. There needs to be some sort of open dialogue, and suppliers or manufacturers of excipients should be really seen as by companies as part of their drug development process, not just simply where you buy or procure excipients when you need to have them. I think the dialogue should start very much earlier than that. And then, there's lots of different grades of excipients. It's not one grade fits all. And I think that basic understanding is somewhat lost sometimes, until it may be too late. When you get to manufacturing and you're sourcing an excipient from somewhere else, a different type of grade that you used in your development because it's no longer available, then sometimes you come into problems. And then you would say if you collaboration at the beginning and you work more closely together, that type of issue may go away. So I think for efficiency as well, and for, again, we're talking here about the patient at the end, to get the best treatment to a patient, the most stable drug, the most efficacious drug product, then the whole process needs to come closer together. We had that obviously in COVID. It's all very much documented now. And Ian just commented on the regulatory side, seems to be learning from there, but I think there's still some learnings that we had during that time that's not transferable necessarily to all parts of our industry.
Rob Brown?
Yeah, I would like to echo indeed the need for collaboration and communication, and I truly think that if excipient producers, excipient users, and regulators all work together, well, the best is yet to come.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd agree with that. The work of IPEC or the work of Excipient, the work of PSCI is fundamentally important, that collaboration across different parts of the industry, but then those different parts coming together as well to just set those consistent standards, a clear expectation on the whole of the supply chain, but ultimately that's underpinned by the transparency, the due diligence, the certifications, which provide a safe way for the future.
Yeah, and also communicating everything, you know, to the wider public, which is what we're doing today. So thank you so much to you all for joining me to have this really great discussion. Hopefully our viewers will have found it very, very interesting. But again, I'd like to thank Ian Moore, Nigel Langley, Rob Williams and Bram Burt for joining me today on this wonderful, wonderful panel discussion.